I'm Eva Marsh, 41, and I went from a little girl that was told jets were not for girls to commanding a classified joint air task force. For years, I chased excellence, served through deployments, and kept hoping my father would finally see what I had built. But when I arrived at my brother's Navy commissioning and someone saw my clothes before they saw my record, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been underestimated by someone whose approval you once needed? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being dismissed, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, self-worth, and finally being seen. What happened next might surprise you. My father's hands smelled like motor oil every Saturday morning. That is the first thing I remember about him. Not his voice, not his face, his hands, and the steady percussion of the FA-18S that crossed over our backyard like clockwork. Low and loud enough that the kitchen window trembled on its frame. We lived close enough to Naval Air Station Oceana that the jets were part of the weather. You learned to talk around them the way you learned to talk around a passing train. You paused mid-sentence, let the sound have the room, and resumed when it cleared. That was the rhythm of the house I grew up in. That was the rhythm of Virginia Beach, a city built in concentric rings around the military presence at its center. That spring, I was 5 years old, and Daniel Marsh was 41. He was a commander in the United States Navy, 05, with the kind of bearing that made rooms rearrange themselves around him without his having to ask. He was in the backyard on a Saturday, in utilities, washing his car when I pointed up at two FA-18S moving in tight formation and asked him what they were. He didn't look up immediately. He ran the chamois over the hood once more and then said, "Navy jets?" I watched them for a moment and asked if I could fly one someday. He laughed. It wasn't cruel, not the way I would come to understand cruelty later, and said, "Little girls don't fly those, princess." Then he went back to the soap and the hose, and I sat on the back steps and watched until the jets disappeared into the haze over the waterline. I don't remember being angry. I remember the sound. I remember thinking that if I could be inside one of those, the rest of it would make sense. What the rest of it meant at 5 years old, I couldn't have articulated. I can articulate it now. It meant I want to be in the room where the serious things happen. I want to be taken seriously in that room. I want that more than I have ever wanted anything, and I am going to figure out how to get there. Margaret Marsh, my mother, was 38 that spring and already practiced in the art of moving through rooms without disturbing the air in them. She was kind in the way that people are kind when kindness feels safer than confrontation, and she loved us both with a thoroughness that did not require her to notice when things were unequal. She waved at me from the back door that morning. I waved back. That was our language, and it served us well enough for a long time. 4 years later, I was 10 years old and sitting at the kitchen table on a Saturday when my father announced he was taking my brother Wyatt to see a Navy destroyer docked at the pier. Wyatt was 7, born in the summer of 1986, 3 years after me, and from the time he could walk, he carried our father's approval like something that had been issued to him at birth. Easy and unquestioned, the way some people carry their last names. He lit up the way he always did when Daniel said his name. I asked if I could come. My father looked at me, genuinely looked at me, the way people look when they are deciding something they have already decided, and said, "It's a lot of walking. Your mother has things you can help with here." He said it the way you'd report the weather, as if it were a fact of nature rather than a choice he was making. Wyatt didn't argue. He was 7, and he didn't yet have the vocabulary for what was happening. I watched the car back out of the driveway from the kitchen window, and then I did the dishes. All of them, very carefully and in order and without speaking. My mother said nothing. She stood at the counter and made a shopping list and did not look up. That was its own kind of instruction, and I absorbed it the way children absorb everything, completely and without knowing I was doing it. Daniel Marsh was, by that point, a Navy captain, 06, the highest rank he would reach before retirement. He had come to that rank through a career of surface warfare and quiet authority, and the specific discipline of a man who believed deeply that things should be in their proper order. The order he believed in had slots for certain people, and my brother fit his slot, and I did not fit mine, and he had arranged his attention accordingly without ever examining the arrangement. I found the Civil Air Patrol on my own when I was 13. I read about it in a pamphlet at my school library, a single folded sheet of paper on a rack between a poster about fire safety and a flyer for the chess club, and I attended 3 meetings before I told my parents, because I was not sure what I would do if they said no. The CAP met at a small airfield outside Virginia Beach, and the smell of aviation fuel and hot asphalt was the smell of everything I had been trying to get to since I was 5 years old, watching jets from the back steps. The first time I went up in a Cessna 172 with a flight instructor, we were in the air for 12 minutes. I was 13 and shaking when we landed and grinning so hard that my face hurt from it. I came home and told my parents at dinner. Daniel nodded. He said, "That's something." That weekend, he drove Wyatt 2 hours to a Navy football game, his first. I stayed home and read everything I could find about the United States Air Force, starting with the promotional materials and ending with the congressional records on the Air Force Academy's admissions process, working through it until the library books were overdue and then starting over. By 13, I had already learned the shape of the thing. Wyatt's ordinary days carried more currency with my father than my extraordinary ones. I arrived at this conclusion not with bitterness, but with the same precision I was already applying to everything else. I observed it enough times that it stopped surprising me, and then I decided what to do with it. What I did was work. I was 16 when I joined AFJROTC at my high school, and I was 17 when I received my appointment to the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. I brought the letter to the dinner table and placed it beside my father's plate, the way you might place a document that requires attention. He read it, he looked up at me, he said, "That's nice. You sure you don't want to try for a regular college? Good programs everywhere." My mother said, "We're proud of you, sweetheart," without raising her eyes from her plate. Wyatt was 14 and sitting across from me, and he gave me the widest, most genuine grin I had ever received from another human being. He mouthed across the table, "That's insane. That's so cool." It was the most honest reaction in the room, and it came with no weight. The weight was my father's to give, and he had decided, consciously or not, deliberately, or by the quiet accumulation of 1,000 smaller decisions, not to give it. I drove for the academy in August of 2002. I was 18 years old, and Daniel Marsh was 54, recently retired, working a civilian defense contractor job that he approached with the same quiet authority he had brought to every command he'd held. He came out to the driveway when I was loading the last box. Wyatt hugged me so hard, I told him I needed to breathe, and he laughed and didn't let go for another full 10 seconds. My mother came out and held me and started to cry and then stopped herself, which was so precisely her that it made my throat close. Then Daniel extended his hand. I shook it. He said, "Good luck out there." He went back inside. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before I started the engine. I told myself it was respect, that he was showing me he trusted me to handle it. I had been translating his silences into compliments for 18 years, and I was practiced at it. I drove out of the driveway and went 4 states away and did not look back until I had to. Wyatt stood in the driveway until I turned the corner at the end of the street. One hand raised, watching until I was gone. I found out later that he stood there for a while after I disappeared and that my mother had to come get him for lunch. That image, Wyatt in the driveway with his hand in the air, would turn out to be the one I carried longest from that morning. Not my father's handshake. My brother, holding the moment one beat past when he needed to. I drove anyway. That was the part I could control. The Air Force Academy sits at the base of the Rampart Range in Colorado Springs. And on the first morning of basic cadet training, the mountains were so vivid they looked unreal, like a backdrop someone had hung behind the real landscape. I was 18 years old, and I had never been this far from Virginia Beach. And I was exhausted before noon, and I was precisely where I needed to be. That combination, complete exhaustion and complete rightness, turned out to be the specific signature of the work I would spend the next 22 years doing. 22 years is a long time to build something. If you are doing it correctly, you spend most of those years not thinking of it as building at all. You think about the next flight, the next brief, the next decision that has to be made well and quickly and without the option of revision. You think about the mission in front of you, not the career accumulating behind you. The accumulation happens anyway. That is, in some ways, the point. My commissioning ceremony at Falcon Stadium was held in May of 2006. I was 22. The Thunderbirds did a flyover that put vibration in your sternum, and graduates threw their caps, and thousands of families cheered from the stands in the Colorado sun. When they pinned on my second lieutenant bars, 01, the entry grade of the officer corps, I had asked a classmate to do it, not my father. I had thought carefully about that choice and made it deliberately. I did not trust what the moment would look like if I handed it to him. At 22, I already understood that some things needed to be protected. Daniel Marsh, 58 years old and retired Navy captain, spent 90 minutes of the post-ceremony reception at the bar with an old Navy colleague whose son had also graduated. He located me once to take a photograph. He said, "Nice ceremony. The Navy's is louder." Then he drifted back. I became an officer of the United States Air Force on a Tuesday in May of 2006. My father spent the reception talking to someone he used to know. I told myself it was fine. It was also not fine. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and I had been carrying that particular weight long enough to know how to keep it balanced without letting it knock me sideways. Undergraduate pilot training was at Columbus Air Force Base in Mississippi, a year of flight instruction that I began in the fall of 2006 and completed in the spring of 2007. I was 22, going on 23, one of 3 women in my training cohort, and I finished first in my class. There is a satisfaction in that kind of precision that I will not pretend is modest. I worked for it, and I earned it, and I knew the difference between luck and preparation. I reported to my first operational F-16 unit in the summer of 2007, 23 years old, and the jet was everything I had been working toward since a Cessna over Virginia Beach when I was 13. The F-16 is called the Fighting Falcon officially and the VIPER unofficially, and the name suits it. It is a small, agile, brutally fast, single-seat jet that punishes imprecision and rewards the pilot who has stopped thinking about what they're doing and started being someone who simply does it. My call sign came in the fall of 2008. I was 24, a first lieutenant, 02, and newly arrived at my first operational F-16 squadron. Call sign ceremonies have their own rituals, part tradition and part theater, and the name they gave me was Viper 10, a reference to my position in the training stack and to the jet's informal nickname. The name would go into dispatch systems and routing tables, and would follow me through assignments and promotions and combatant commands across 2 decades of service in ways I could not have anticipated at 24. I didn't know that yet. I had a call sign, and the jet was clean under my hands at altitude, and I was doing exactly what I had watched those FA-18s do over our backyard, and told myself, at 5 years old, I would do. Captain came in September of 2010, 03. The phone call home was brief. Then I deployed overseas for 8 months, location undisclosed, context classified, and called home when the time differential allowed and the secure lines were clear. On one of those calls, my father said, "Still flying around over there?" I told him yes. He said, "Well, stay safe." Then asked about Wyatt's spring semester grades. I had been in a combat zone for 6 months. Flying around was one way to characterize it. I made major in June of 2016. 04. I called to tell my parents. Daniel said, "Major, that's like a middle manager, right?" I explained that it was not, and he moved on, and I filed the call in the part of my memory designated for things I had stopped expecting to change. That file had become substantial over the years. Thanksgiving of 2019. I was 35 and had been home 9 days total that calendar year. Wyatt was 32, a civilian attorney at a Virginia practice, and he was sharp in the way our father had always wanted one of his children to be sharp, somewhere visible and comprehensible. I sat across from Wyatt at the same table where I had watched a car back out of the driveway 25 years earlier. My father held court for 45 minutes about Wyatt's law practice, a case won, a client landed, how Wyatt could read a jury. He used the word brilliant 3 times. Wyatt caught my eye across the table and mouthed, "I'm sorry." I shook my head slightly. An aunt turned to me during a lull and asked what I did. Before I could answer, Daniel said, "She works for the Air Force, flies planes." He turned back to Wyatt. Wyatt mouthed it again. I looked at my plate and ate my dinner and did not speak. Lieutenant Colonel came in 2020, 05. Selected below the zone, promoted ahead of my peer group, a distinction fewer than 5% of officers achieve in a given cycle. I was 36 years old. Daniel said he was proud of me. He asked in the same breath whether Wyatt had mentioned anything about his holiday plans. Colonel came in January of 2023, 06. Another below-the-zone selection, the second in my career. I called my parents the same day. There was a pause when I said the word, "Colonel." Daniel said, "Colonel, is that like a real command?" I told him yes, it was a real command. I watched the clock on my office wall. 14 seconds elapsed between the end of my answer and his next sentence. Wyatt mentioned he's looking at something called JAG. You know what that is? Is that a good move for him? I told him it was a good move. He said, "Good. Okay. Proud of you, sweetheart." The call ended. 14 seconds. I had been watching the clock because some part of me already knew it was that kind of call. In March of 2024, I assumed command of a classified Joint Air Task Force. Priority 1 routing was assigned to my call sign in 3 separate combatant command dispatch systems. VIPER 10, Priority 1, a designation that meant my transmission could interrupt a general's in certain communication hierarchies. I did not tell my father any of this. He would not have known what it meant, and I had stopped trying to translate myself for an audience that had stopped listening. November of 2024, Wyatt called me laughing. He had been accepted to the Naval Direct Commission Officer Program, Judge Advocate General Corps. Direct commission at the lieutenant grade, 03, on the strength of 14 years of law practice. His commissioning ceremony was scheduled for March 15th of 2025 at Naval Air Station Norfolk. He was 38 years old, and this was his first day as a military officer, and our father was already booking hotel rooms for 40 relatives and arranging for a rear admiral to preside. Daniel called me that same week. He said, "Wyatt's joining the Navy. Can you believe it? Make sure you're there. This is a big deal." He said it like it had not once occurred to him, in 23 years, that his daughter was already in a branch of the armed forces. He said, "This is a big deal to a colonel commanding a classified task force, as though I might not understand what a commissioning ceremony was." I had been commissioned in a stadium with the Thunderbirds overhead. He spent that reception at the bar. I noted all of this without drama and confirmed that I would be there. I had already arranged transport. I always arrange transport. My 6-week overseas debrief concluded at 0600 local time on March 14th of 2025. I had been awake 19 hours. I changed into the only clothes I had accessible, jeans, a worn USAF ball cap, a jacket, because I was transiting directly to Norfolk and there was no time to stop at my quarters. 1 bag, military transport to the continental United States, connecting flight to Norfolk, touchdown at 17:45 on March 14th. Hotel near the base. 4.5 hours of sleep. 05:30, I was up. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to everything that follows. I was not in civilian clothes as a statement. I was in civilian clothes because I had been in 3 countries in 6 weeks and had landed in Virginia on a Tuesday night with 1 bag and a 4.5-hour window before I needed to be on a military installation. I was there because I had prioritized Wyatt's commissioning over my own logistics, at real cost at the end of an extended and demanding overseas assignment. The jeans were incidental. The choice to show up was not. 10 minutes out from the base, I called Wyatt from the rental sedan. He answered before the second ring and launched immediately into the details of the seating chart and the order of proceedings, and whether the coffee in the anteroom was the kind you could actually drink. I could hear my father's voice in the background organizing something. He had a voice designed for organizing, broad and carrying, the voice of a man who was comfortable being heard across a room. The ceremony started at 10:00. Wyatt said, "I'm really glad you made it." I said, "I know, me too." Both of those were true and completely true, and I meant them in that simple way. The call ended, and I drove the last stretch thinking about Wyatt's face when I walked through the door. Not about the ceremony, not about my father. Wyatt's face. I pulled up to the vehicle entry gate at Naval Air Station Norfolk at approximately 0930. I had my military identification ready. The gate guard had begun running my plate and my credentials against the base registry. Rear Admiral Howard Pell was 58 years old, 08 in the United States Navy, a career surface warfare officer of the kind for whom authority has become as natural and unexamined as breathing. He moved through rooms with the specific ease of someone who has never once had to wonder whether his presence there was in question. He was at that moment exiting the gatehouse with his aide, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, 36 years old, 04, efficient and attentive in the way of officers who have learned to anticipate their seniors' social moves before they happen, after a command meeting that had run past its scheduled end. Both were en route to the commissioning ceremony. Admiral Pell was presiding, arranged through my father's old Navy contacts. He saw the rental sedan, woman in a ball cap and jeans, window down, no rank visible. He walked to my window and leaned in with the comfortable presumption of someone who has never been wrong about a room. He said, "You lost, Princess? Officers' wives park back there." Webb chuckled behind him, a practiced social chuckle, the kind that said, "I follow my senior's lead." I kept both hands on the wheel. I looked at Admiral Pell. I did not say anything. His radio crackled in his breast pocket. Webb's pager sounded simultaneously. Base operations had been attempting to reach the Admiral for 60 seconds. "Admiral, stand down! That's Viper 10, priority 1. Escort her through." The gate guard, who had been running my credentials, snapped to rigid attention. Pell's face went through a sequence that I have thought about since. The jaw first, then the eyes, then something that was not quite a blink, but was something in the neighborhood of one. He stepped back from the car window. He came to full attention. He rendered a salute to a woman in jeans and a ball cap, and his salute was correct and precise, because whatever else he was a naval officer, and he understood what the moment required of him. Webb pressed himself against the gatehouse wall. He had located a point on the far side of the road to focus on, and he focused on it with the determination of someone who had decided that he was not here. I acknowledged the salute with a brief nod. The gate lifted. The duty escort vehicle was already pulling up behind the rental sedan. I drove through. The word princess was still hanging in the air behind me at the gate. I did not need to collect it. The radio had done what needed doing, and the record had spoken for itself. And I had not said a single word in my own defense, because I had not needed to. 23 years of work had handled it. Inside the ceremony hall, which was arranged with chairs and Navy flags and the particular formal quiet of a room that is about to become important, Wyatt spotted me from across the floor the moment I came through the door. He crossed to me immediately, not quickly, deliberately, like a man who knows exactly where he is going. He looked at me for a moment the way you look at someone you have been waiting for and are relieved to see standing in front of you. Then he said, in front of 40 family members and guests and a presiding flag officer and his own new commanding officer, "Pin my bars on me. I want it to be you." It was not a small request. He had a father in the front row and a rear admiral at the podium. He passed both of them and came to me. I looked at him for a moment. I said, "All right." Before the ceremony began, Admiral Pell approached me. He was formal about it in the way of a military officer who understands that a formal apology is the minimum the situation requires, and who has decided to meet that minimum precisely. He said, "Colonel Marsh, I owe you an apology. That was unacceptable." I said, "Yes, it was." I did not make it easier for him to leave the discomfort than the discomfort needed to be. Webb stood 6 feet behind his admiral and studied a point on the far wall with dedicated attention. The ceremony proceeded. Wyatt was commissioned a lieutenant in the United States Navy, JAG Corps. When the moment came, I stepped forward and pinned his silver lieutenant's bars. 03 on the naval pay grade table. The grade his 14 years of law practice had qualified him for under the direct commission program. I straightened them carefully because I am careful with things that matter. I said quietly, close enough that only he could hear, "Welcome aboard, Lieutenant." He was smiling. I was not quite, but something in my face was open in a way it had not been when I walked through that gate in jeans and a ball cap 90 minutes earlier. My father sat in the front row through all of it. I did not look at him during the ceremony. I already knew what I would see, and I was not yet ready to carry it. I looked at Wyatt. That was enough. Daniel Marsh, 77 years old, retired Navy Captain 06, a man who had spent 2 decades believing that his daughter was doing something peripheral and decorative with her time, watched a rear admiral salute her in a parking lot, and then cross a ceremony hall to apologize to her formally in front of 40 witnesses. He watched his son bypass an assembled roomful of relatives and a presiding flag officer to ask his daughter to pin his bars. He sat very still through all of it. His face had the quality of a man doing arithmetic that he had not expected, and that is yielding an answer he does not recognize. He did not say anything in that room, but something had started, quietly behind his eyes, that would take months to become words. The parking lot was quieter than the hall. Most of the family was still inside, with Wyatt, My mother, the relatives, the guests who had driven from across several states for a commissioning that my father had described as the most significant event in recent family memory. I was at the rental car with my bag, thinking about the drive back and whether I could make the afternoon transport if I left in the next 30 minutes, when Daniel came across the lot. He said my name, not sweetheart. My name. I turned. He looked at me for a moment, at the ball cap, the jeans, the single bag, the space where the gate escort's vehicle had been. He was a man who had always been comfortable arriving somewhere and understanding it immediately. He did not look comfortable. He looked like someone who has arrived somewhere unfamiliar and is trying to orient without making the disorientation visible and is not quite succeeding. Then he said, "What is it that you actually do?" 23 years. That was how long he had had to ask that question. 23 years of promotions and deployments and combat zones and classified assignments and command tours and Priority 1 routing across 3 combatant commands. 23 years of flying around and middle manager and is that a real command and 14 seconds between my 06 promotion and his question about my brother. I held the question for a beat, not dramatically, just long enough to let it be what it was. Then I reached into the center console of the rental car and took out a business card. I kept a supply there for coordination meetings and points of contact who needed something in writing. The card read, Colonel Eva S. Marsh, USAF, Joint Task Force Commander. I handed it to him. I said, "If you ever want to keep talking, call that number." I got in the car. I closed the door. I drove out of the parking lot. In my rearview mirror, he was still standing in the same spot, reading the card with both hands. I drove surface streets back toward the hotel. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call anyone. I ran back through the morning, not pellet the gate, which had crossed the line into the kind of absurdity that neutralizes itself, but the parking lot, my father's face when he asked the question. The specific quality of his confusion. Not shame, not anger, not the recognition of wrongdoing. Blankness. Genuine blankness. He didn't know. Not really. He had been watching me serve for 23 years and had never assembled the information into anything coherent because he had never tried to, because he had not believed the assembling was necessary. I wasn't angry driving through Norfolk. I was tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep, the kind that comes from decades of translating yourself for someone who never learned the language and never asked to be taught. Not cruelty, ignorance. 23 years of it, carefully maintained without anyone ever meaning to maintain it. I kept arriving at that, going around it, arriving again. I kept driving. 3 days later, I was back at my command post. I worked through the accumulated inbox in order, the way I always worked, methodically, without letting the pile become something I was afraid of. Late March, I called Renee Okafor from my office. She was 45 years old, Lieutenant Colonel, 05, the most capable intelligence officer I had worked alongside through 2 classified assignments over the prior 4 years. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, without formulating her response while I was still speaking. I told her the full day, the gate, the radio, the ceremony. Wyatt asking me to pin his bars, Pell's apology, the parking lot, the business card, my father in the rearview mirror reading my name. When I finished, there was a silence. Then she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it genuinely before I answered. I said, like I've been holding something for a very long time and I just put it down, and my arm doesn't know what to do. She said, "Give your arm a minute." It was exactly the right thing to say. I went back to work. 2 weeks passed without a call from Daniel. I noticed I was not rehearsing what I would say when he called. I was not reviewing the parking lot conversation, looking for the version where I had said it differently. I was thinking about my mission and my team and the operational calendar and the brief I had due on Friday. The absence of that particular mental noise was so unfamiliar that I had to sit with it for a moment to understand what it was. I filed it carefully and kept working, because that was what there was to do. He called on April 22nd, 38 days after Norfolk. The business card number reached my administrative desk first, which told him, when the clerk answered with my full title and unit designation, something about the infrastructure that supported the person he had leaned into a car window to condescend to. The clerk told him Colonel Marsh would return his call at her convenience. 4 days later, I called back. I was professional. I did not perform warmth I didn't feel, but I was not cold. I told him I was willing to talk. I told him what that would look like. Real questions and real answers, without pretending that the last 23 years had unfolded differently than they had. I said, "If you call to tell me you're proud of me, I'll listen. If you call to work through your guilt on my time, I'll need you to find another way." There was a pause. Then he said, "Okay, that's fair." In our entire adult relationship, those 3 words were the first sentence he had said to me that contained no deflection, no pivot, no diminishment. Not, "I did my best," or, "You know how I am," or a transition into a topic he felt better equipped to navigate. Just, "That's fair." He said it with the plainness of someone who has finally heard a sentence the same way it was spoken. I noted it without assigning it more weight than it had yet earned. My mother called in May. She was worried about Daniel. He had been quiet since Norfolk, she said, in a way that she didn't entirely know what to do with. She used the phrases she had always used when navigating around my father's discomfort. "He's not young anymore. We're family. You know how he is." She stopped just short of asking me to apologize. I said, "Mom, I handed him a way in. I gave him my number and told him to call if he wants to keep talking. That's what I have to offer right now." She was quiet. Then she said, "I just don't want anyone to be hurt." I said, "I know, but that's already happened. What we're deciding now is what happens next." She didn't push. She had spent decades managing my father's discomfort at the cost of mine, and I did not think she had a clear view of that pattern, and this phone call was not the place to draw her the map. I loved her. I held the line. Wyatt called in May, too, from Norfolk, 1 month into his commission. He asked me 3 specific questions about navigating the transition from civilian life to military hierarchy, and I answered them directly. Not as his older sister, but as a colonel who had made that transition 23 years earlier and had spent the intervening time watching people manage it well and badly. Then he got quiet. He said, "I should have said something, years ago. Every time he talked about your career like it was nothing, and I didn't push back. I made it easier for him to keep doing it." I was quiet. I said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know that too." The call ran another 40 minutes. We talked about almost nothing important. It was the best phone call I had had in years. His apology landed differently than I expected because he was not trying to resolve his own guilt through it. He was stating a fact about himself and accepting it without asking me to make it smaller for him. I did not have to manage the apology. I received it. "June." Daniel called again. He began moving toward a large, encompassing apology, the general kind that asks for relief, without specifying what it's relieving or what the person is prepared to do differently. I redirected. I said, "Dad, if you want to know me, ask me something specific. Ask me what my week looked like. Ask me what the hardest decision I made this month was. That's the conversation I'm available for." A pause. Then he asked, "What was the hardest decision you made this month?" I told him in broad strokes, nothing classified. He listened for 6 minutes without speaking. When I finished, he said, "That sounds like a real job." I said, "It is." It was simultaneously the most inadequate and the most honest thing he had said to me in 23 years. I accepted it as the floor, the lowest starting point of something that might eventually become a different kind of conversation. I hung up the phone, sat for a moment, picked up a mission brief, and kept working. Daniel Marsh did not stop at the phone calls. In the summer of 2025, he began making other ones to former Navy colleagues, people he had served with, people who understood the architecture of military command in ways he had, apparently, never needed to think about in relation to his daughter. A retired vice admiral he had served under took 20 minutes on the phone in June to explain what it meant operationally for a colonel to command a classified joint air task force. He explained Priority 1 routing. He explained what Joint Command Authority meant across service branches. He said, "Dan, your daughter has a higher operational clearance than anyone you've met in person. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I learned about that call 6 months later from Wyatt. My father never mentioned it. I think it embarrassed him too much to repeat what he had been told about someone he had dismissed as flying around. Wyatt drove to Virginia Beach in July and sat down at the kitchen table, the same table with the same chairs and the same quality of late morning light that had been there my entire life, and told our father, in measured and specific terms, what he had watched for 30 years, that Daniel had never attended a single one of Eva's promotion ceremonies, that he had never once called after her overseas deployments to ask whether she had landed safely, that he had referred to her career as flying around and playing with toys in conversations with other people, at dinner tables where Eva sat and heard every word. That he had spent the better part of Eva's adult life narrating Wyatt's accomplishments to relatives, while Eva sat at the same table having her own unreported. "I was part of it," Wyatt said, "because I never said anything. I made it easier for you to keep doing it by never pushing back." Daniel didn't argue. He didn't offer explanations that functioned as excuses. He sat with what Wyatt had said, which is the harder thing to do than arguing. My mother got up from the table 8 minutes in and walked to the back of the house. She didn't come back. Wyatt said, "You never called after her deployments, not once, to ask if she landed safe. Do you know that?" After a long silence, my father said, "No, I didn't know that." He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had allowed his assumptions to remain unchallenged for decades because nobody had pushed back against them, and who was now being required to push back against himself. That is the harder direction. Meanwhile, I was commanding a task force. In August of 2025, we ran a major operational readiness exercise. 18 hours, complex multi-domain scenario. Rapid decisions made with incomplete information in conditions that were designed to replicate the actual conditions of operational command. Which is to say, demanding, ambiguous, and unforgiving of hesitation. At 02:15 hours, the final phase concluded. The exercise was assessed as a full success. Chief Master Sergeant Rosa Torres, 47 years old, E9. Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force's highest enlisted grade, and the most experienced senior enlisted advisor I had worked with in my career, looked at me across the command post when the assessment came in. She said, "Ma'am, that's one of the best I've seen." I said, "We did that together." I wrote the debrief report. I was in my quarters by 0400 hours. I slept 6 hours without difficulty. I was not thinking about my father. My 42nd birthday was on a Saturday in early September. I worked most of it. Wyatt had sent a card. Inside he had drawn an F-16 in pencil. A surprisingly accurate likeness for someone who had never flown anything and who had learned to recognize the airframe from photographs I'd sent years before. Beneath the drawing he had written, "VIPER 10 Priority 1. Happy birthday, I'm proud of you." I read it at my desk and laughed. Not the polite laugh of someone receiving a thoughtful gesture, the genuine laugh of someone who has been seen clearly by someone who knows them. Daniel sent a card too. Inside, in his handwriting, which I recognized from the questions he had written in the margins of the printed documents, was a note of 5 sentences. He said he was proud of me. He said he didn't know how to make up for the time that had gone. He said he would like to try to understand what I did, if I would allow it. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not impose a timeline. 5 sentences, and every one of them was about me. No subject change, no pivot to Wyatt. No reaching towards something else when the direct thing became uncomfortable. Just 5 sentences about his daughter, written in his handwriting, mailed to my command address, which meant he had used the business card. I read it twice. I set it on my desk. At the end of the day, I picked it up and put it in my desk drawer. I didn't throw it away. I wasn't ready to know what to do with it. I kept it anyway. October, a Sunday afternoon. Daniel called with a notepad. I could hear the pen adjusting against paper on his end of the line, the particular sound of someone who is prepared, who has thought about what they wanted to ask and written it down so they wouldn't forget. He said, "Can you explain to me what your day looks like?" A normal one. I told him, broadly, within what I could say about classified work, which was less than the full picture, but more than I had ever offered before because he was asking and asking was new. He asked follow-up questions. What does joint mean in Joint Task Force? How many people does she command? What does the classification level mean in terms of what he could know about her day-to-day work? He asked carefully, like a man who understood he was working from a significant deficit and who had decided to close it without pretending the deficit wasn't there. He did not interrupt me once to talk about the Navy. He did not compare. He did not pivot. He listened. At one point he asked, "What's the hardest part of command?" I said, "The decisions that follow you home." There was a pause. Then he said, "Yeah, I know that one." 4 words. A retired officer to an active one, 2 people who had each spent careers making decisions that outlasted the moment they were made, speaking to each other from that shared ground for the first time. I didn't say anything about it. I filed it in the place where I kept things that were small and real and worth tracking. In October and November, Wyatt and I talked every week. He was finding his bearings in his JAG unit and asking sharp questions about things I could genuinely help with. He told me about the kitchen table conversation, not as a victory, but plainly, as a report. He didn't argue. I don't know what that means yet. He told me that Daniel had been asking him to explain an Air Force colonel's career trajectory, promotion timelines, command structures, what below-the-zone selection meant in practice. He said, "He asked me to print out the Air Force promotion board process. I did. He didn't know there was a below-the-zone selection. He didn't know you'd been selected twice." I was quiet for a moment. I said, "He didn't ask." Wyatt said, "No, he didn't." We sat with that for a moment, both of us holding it, neither of us needing to make it into something other than what it was. Then I said, "Thank you for telling me, and thank you for the kitchen table." He said, "It was about 20 years past due." I said, "Yeah, but you did it." In November, I drove to Virginia Beach, 3 years since my last visit. I sat in the driveway for a moment before I went in, not dramatically, just long enough to take a breath and locate where I was. The house was the same color it had been when I left at 18. The garden was smaller than I remembered, or I was larger. My mother opened the door and held me without saying anything, which was exactly the right choice. Daniel was in the kitchen. He had printed several publicly available documents about Air Force Joint Task Force command structures, 9 pages in total, and arranged them on the kitchen table with the edges aligned. The way you set a report you've prepared for a meeting with someone who will be evaluating your preparation. He had highlighted 3 of the 9 pages. I could see his handwriting in the margins before I sat down, questions written out so he wouldn't forget to ask them. He had prepared for a conversation with me. It was the first time in my life I could say that sentence. We talked for 2 hours about the work, the promotions, what Priority 1 routing meant, and how it functioned in dispatch systems across combatant commands, what a joint task force command required from its commander at the operational level. He asked questions from the printed stack. Some of them were good questions. One of them was very good, specific, structural, the kind that shows the person has actually thought about the answer before asking. My mother brought coffee and mostly listened. It was the longest sustained conversation Daniel Marsh and I had managed in 22 years of my professional life. Near the end of the visit, he asked if he could see my military ID. I took it from my wallet and handed it to him. He read it. Colonel Eva S. Marsh, USAF. He held it carefully, the way you hold something you've been given access to and understand, finally, with full weight, that you should have asked to see a long time ago. He said, "I'm proud of you." He said it looking at the card, not at me, which was perhaps the only way he knew how to say it directly. I said, "I know." I took the ID back and put it in my wallet. I did not forgive him in that room. I did not tell him everything was fine because everything was not fine. And telling him it was would have undone the 2 hours we had just spent saying true things. I sat with him for another 20 minutes and then I drove home. I did not leave angry. That was different from every time I had left before. And I noticed the difference the way you notice when a familiar sound is absent, not with relief exactly, but with recognition. Somewhere between December of 2025 and February of 2026, I noticed that something had shifted, not resolved, not finished, but changed in texture and weight. The closest comparison I have is the way air changes pressure before weather arrives. You can feel it in your chest before you can name it. I was sleeping 7 hours most nights, which was 2 more than I had averaged in the previous 3 years. I was running again, a 3-mile loop near my command post that I had abandoned in 2019 when operational tempo had consumed every available margin of my schedule. I woke up some mornings and lay still for 30 seconds before the day began, which was entirely new. Christmas Day I spent on base. My team organized food, and there was a playlist someone had assembled that ran heavily toward music from older decades, and the mood in the common room was the particular ease of people who had worked alongside each other long enough to trust each other without having to perform it. At 1400 hours, Daniel called. 9 minutes. He had attempted a new recipe for Christmas dinner, and it had gone badly, and my mother had not let the subject close. I laughed, genuinely, without effort, the laugh of someone hearing something that is simply funny. He said, "Merry Christmas, Eva." He used my name, not sweetheart, not princess. My name, spoken plainly, the way you speak someone's name when you mean it to be their name, and nothing more than that. I noticed it the way I had learned to notice small, precise things. I said, "Merry Christmas, Dad." I went back to the party. I know how small that sounds, a name used plainly in a 9-minute phone call about a ruined dinner. I also know it wasn't small, not given the history of the particular word he had been reaching for instead. January of 2026. I sat at my desk on a Tuesday morning and took stock, the way I had taken stock at intervals throughout my career, with the same precision I brought to operational assessments. My relationship with Daniel was not repaired, was being repaired carefully, incrementally, the way structural restoration works. Attention paid to what is actually there rather than to what it should have been, no false certainty about when it will be finished or whether it will hold. My relationship with Wyatt was the strongest it had been since childhood. We talked every week. His commissioning photograph was on my desk. My professional life was at its clearest peak. The command was performing, the team was solid, I was sleeping, and I was making decisions without second-guessing them through the specific lens of what my father might think if he knew. I realized, sitting at that desk on that Tuesday, that I had not in the past 10 days checked my phone for a call from him. I had checked it for operational messages, not for him. The waiting had stopped without my noticing it stop, and now I was noticing its absence and learning what the space felt like. February, late evening, a readiness briefing due the next morning. I was at my desk. My nameplate sat in the foreground, Colonel EVA S. Marsh. I looked at my reflection in the dark window, the uniform, the eagle on my collar, the quiet authority of the office arranged around me, and a question arrived without urgency, without distress, the way certain questions arrive when there is finally enough room for them. How much of who I became was built around trying to prove something to him, and how much was simply who I was going to be, regardless? I did not have the answer. I was not frightened by that. The wanting to know felt new and clean and free of the old pain, which was its own kind of information. I went back to the briefing. The question stayed in the room with me. So did I, and I was not uncomfortable sharing the room with it. In February of 2026, I started running again in the mornings. 3 miles, the same loop near my command post, nothing heroic about it. I just went out and ran. And somewhere in the middle of mile 2 one morning, I realized I was not thinking about anything except mile 3, the mission in front of me, not the accumulated weight of a career built in rooms that weren't looking, not the sound of a radio crackling at a gate, not a father standing in a parking lot reading my name on a business card. Just mile 3, just the work directly in front of me. It was enough. It was honestly a great deal. On March 15th, 1 year to the day after the gate at Naval Air Station Norfolk, I drove through a security gate at a military facility in the Norfolk area for a routine joint coordination meeting. I was in full uniform. The gate guard recognized my rank insignia and snapped to. I drove through, and I thought about the anniversary for approximately the length of one song on the radio. The jeans and the ball cap, the rental sedan, Admiral Pell at the window and his radio in his pocket, and the specific sequence in which the color had left his face, the gate lifting, the word, princess, left hanging in the air. The song ended. I thought about my briefing. A year later, and I could hold the whole thing in 30 seconds and then set it down. That is not forgetting. That is arriving somewhere and knowing you're there. April. Renee and I had lunch at a restaurant near the command post. She was 46 now, with a selection board coming up, and we talked about what was next. For her, for me. I had been thinking about my next assignment, about the kind of command I was moving toward, about whether the 07 board was something I was actively aiming at or something I was staying open to. I said, I've spent most of my career making decisions to be undeniable, to make it impossible for the people who doubted me to ignore what I was doing. Renee said, and now? I held it for a moment. I said, now I want to make decisions because they're the right ones, not to prove a point to anyone. She raised her coffee cup and said, to that. I raised mine. We drank to it. That is the distinction at the center of everything, excellence performed for an audience versus excellence chosen for its own sake. I had been doing both for a long time, and I had not always been able to tell which was which. I could tell now. That clarity was what 23 years and one morning at a gate and a parking lot conversation and a business card and 5 sentences and a birthday card and a father with a notepad on a Sunday afternoon had eventually added up to. There is this thing nobody tells you about spending years in rooms that don't believe in you. You get very good at doing the work anyway. You get very good at being excellent in spite of them, and then eventually for spite of them, until the spite and the love of the work become so woven together that you cannot always find where one ends and the other begins. The gate happened because I drove up to a barrier in a rental sedan and a ball cap, and a stranger looked at me and saw a lost wife in civilian clothes. And then the radio corrected him. What happened next had nothing to do with anything I did in that moment, and everything to do with the 23 years I had put in before I pulled up to that gate. I didn't manufacture the moment. I showed up for my brother's commissioning because he asked me to be there, and I loved him. The record did the rest. My father held my military ID in his hands in November and read my name on it like he was reading it for the first time. In a way, he was. I don't know how the rest of that goes. I don't need to know yet. What I know is that I built something real, a career, a record, a call sign that interrupts transmissions, a command that my father needed 20 minutes from a retired vice admiral to begin to understand. I did not build it to show him. I did not build it to prove Admiral Pell wrong. I built it because the work was good, and I was good at it, and that was always enough. I just needed enough room to believe it fully. And now I have the room, and I believe it. If you have been excellent in a room that wasn't looking, keep going. The record is accumulating. You may not be able to see it from where you are standing, but it is there, and it is exact, and it does not require an audience to be true. One day, someone's radio is going to crackle, and when it does, you will not have to say a single word. And if this story reminded you of a time you were overlooked, underestimated, or forced to prove your worth to people who should have believed in you, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to walk away from someone's approval just to finally respect yourself? Have you ever stayed quiet for too long, then realized your peace mattered more than being understood? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button if this story spoke to you, and subscribe for more true stories about strength, boundaries, and finally choosing yourself.